So the iPhone 6 is one of those phones that came out many years ago, and to be honest, I made a video last year talking about how I kind of feel bad about this iPhone, mostly because the successor of this device, the iPhone 6s, ended up getting so many more versions of software support on top of this phone that I kind of felt bad about this device, because when you look at the iPhone 6 and you look at the 6s, there are over 3 versions of operating system full iOS updates between those devices, which is so crazy. However, the iPhone 6 is still a fairly interesting iPhone because it was one of the best-selling, or still one of the best-selling iPhones of all time. It was a pretty big body change, although the internals were pretty much the same as the predecessor, but it was also kind of still being supported for the time being. Although we haven't gotten another iOS 12 update in 2022, we did get several iOS updates for iOS 12 in 2021. So it's still very interesting that this device is still somewhat supported, and this phone came out in 2014. So the fact that this phone is still kind of supported is really crazy to me. And although I wouldn't recommend buying this phone anymore, I'm still, I still have a lot of respect for this device, and I do like it at the end of the day. If you want to buy this phone, links will be down in the description. Probably not this device, but I'll leave some other ones linked in the description. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now, on the outside of the body, the iPhone 6 has that 4.7-inch IPS panel, 750p, which is higher than HD, which looks pretty good. And the panel itself isn't bad, like I've mentioned before. It's just kind of everything surrounding the panel. You have, a pretty thick amount of bezel around it. Home button still, which is pretty outdated. But one thing's for sure, when you look at this phone and you look at the iPhone SE 2, Apple is still selling an iPhone that looks almost exactly like this. And this iPhone kind of originated that design. So that's another pretty interesting thing about this device too. Now, you do have the lightning port at the bottom and the headphone jack as well. So still some I/O that, we kind of still have. We still have the lightning ports and everything, but we don't really have headphone jacks anymore, which this phone actually had, which is really cool. On the back, we have that full aluminum back, which still feels extremely premium. And one thing that I've mentioned before, Apple has never made a cheap feeling iPhone. None of these iPhones feel cheap, maybe except the 5C, but this device still feels extremely premium. It does not feel cheap at all, but it does miss a couple of important things. It doesn't have a glass back, which is kind of, up to you if you like it or not. Me personally, I kind of like it. This one doesn't have it. There is no wireless charging either, which I'm kind of indifferent about nowadays, but it doesn't have any IP certification. So you can't dip this thing in water, or if you get a little bit of water on it, it could potentially, have some damage to it too, which, some people may not prefer, but that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, we do have to hit on the cameras of this iPhone. Now, this device on the back has a single 8 megapixel standard lens, and on the front it has a 1.2 megapixel standard lens as well. Now, you can do 1080p at 60 frames per second on the back of this phone. On the front, you can do 720p. So right there, some pretty big red flags. No 4K at 30 or 60 on the front or the back of this iPhone, which is already pretty outdated. But another big thing to keep in mind is that when you look at the latest iPhones, like the 13 Pros, even like the iPhone 10, all those iPhones have dual camera setups or triple camera setups. Unfortunately, this one only has that single standard lens. So no ultra wide and no telephoto lens either, which may be a big downgrade or downside to some of you. And to me personally, that is kind of a big downgrade. So that's a pretty big thing to keep in mind as well. I will say the camera quality of this thing isn't bad. If you need to take some photos here and there or videos, I'm sure you can get some pretty decent quality photos or videos from this thing. But I will tell you, when compared to cameras nowadays, it is pretty outdated. And that's something I've been kind of saying with a lot of these other iPhones. You don't want to get a phone and already feel like you have an outdated machine. With this one, I don't want to say it feels completely outdated, but it does feel a little bit older than if you actually were to pick up something even like an iPhone 6s. That phone has the ability of shooting 4K. This one, on the other hand, does not have that ability. So although this camera really isn't worth it anymore, I will still say, it still turns on, it still takes photos, and, if you like it, go for it. I'm sure most of you probably don't like this camera anymore, and you probably want to switch to something like an iPhone 6s at the bare minimum. So in terms of that pretty much covers up the camera side. Now, I do want to talk about the longevity of this iPhone as well. Like I mentioned, this thing stopped getting software support many years ago. It's not getting any more updates anymore anytime soon, at least for the most part. But it did get security updates recently, which was a really cool thing. Back in 2021, it got several software updates, and it kind of just kept going, and that's the crazy thing about this iPhone, is that it just doesn't really die, which I have a lot of respect for, Apple for keeping to support this phone. But do keep in mind that the 6s got full OS updates for many years. And that's another crazy thing to keep in mind as well. So in terms of that, the longevity aspect right there is pretty important. I do want to hit on another pretty big thing about the iPhone 6 which actually was bendgate. As most of you remember, these iPhones and the 6 Plus bent really easily. And although it doesn't have anything to do with software, that was another pretty big thing to keep in mind. So when you're getting this phone, do keep in mind that the durability of it isn't as high as maybe something even like a 6S. I hate to bring the 6S up every 5 seconds, but because it was a pretty big difference from this phone and that phone, it only makes sense. And with the iPhone 6, if you're not planning on putting a case on it or anything, do keep in mind that it could potentially end up, bending in half or something too. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up there. Now, hitting on the software side of things, this device does have that Apple A8 chip inside of it with 1GB of RAM. Now, here's the thing about this iPhone, like I mentioned before, this is still a decent iPhone in terms of the age and in terms of the price. It's not a good performing iPhone anymore, so I wouldn't recommend buying this iPhone and expect to get a really good performing phone. That is not the case here. But if you're getting an iPhone like this, I think you'd be kind of surprised how somewhat smooth this device is right now. Personally, I wouldn't want to use this phone. I think the RAM, it's very slow, and I don't really like using that home button anymore. It's kind of outdated, but I will say apps are still somewhat updated on this phone. This phone is still getting security updates, which is pretty crazy. And if I had to use it every day, I think I could, but I just wouldn't really enjoy it. It is very laggy and it is very glitchy compared to all other devices that I've been testing. And even like a basic iPhone that came out like within the last 5 years, something like an iPhone 7 could give you a better experience than this specific iPhone too. So that is another pretty big thing to keep in mind. I would highly recommend it more than anything to probably not pick up this phone if you want a decent performing iPhone. If you want something, that you can pretty much get now and move on with your life, I would not recommend this iPhone because it's really not that great of a performing phone. And we're only a couple years away from this iPhone, the App Store apps, probably not being supported on this version of iOS either. So that's another thing. If you want to get an iPhone and you don't want to worry about any more, any issues or anything like that, then I would recommend at the bare minimum getting an iPhone 7. That phone's going to last you probably another 2 years, but this iPhone is already outdated by the time of me making this video, and I would probably avoid using it there. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. Hitting on the battery, this device had a 1810 mAh battery, which is actually a pretty decent sized battery for sure for this type of phone at that time. The battery life I don't think at that time was horrible, but it really wasn't that great from the last time I used it and tested it. But another big thing to keep in mind is that battery life has only increased throughout time, and that is a big thing to keep in mind. So if you're planning on getting a phone and pretty much moving on, this would not be my first choice for battery life, but that pretty much covers it up there. There's not much to add there. Now to kind of sum up this video, I will be honest, the iPhone 6 I really don't think is worth it in 2022. I don't think it was worth it even in 2020. This phone has pretty much been outdated for several years now, and that's kind of what happens when you get a phone like this. It's going to be a fairly outdated phone. It's not getting updates, it's not getting full OS updates, but I will say it was a pretty important iPhone. It's still kind of supported, and I'm still kind of surprised by that, but I wouldn't recommend buying this phone, mostly because of it being outdated, and it's not getting any more features. Unless you want to jailbreak this thing and kind of modify it, or you're like a collector, if you're not one of those people, then I probably would not recommend buying this phone anymore in 2022. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.